We are on live right now.
Okay.
So, good morning, everyone. We are very pleased to welcome you to today's lecture. My name is Thais, and this is my colleague, Anna. We are both members of GAAT.
Okay, thank you all for joining us today, both in person and online. It's a great honor to introduce Professor Shaun from Cardiff University, who will be giving a lecture entitled Roman Imperial Grandparents, the Constantinian Dynasty.
Before we begin, Professor Tuffer, may I kindly ask for your permission to make a few brief announcements in Portuguese and to introduce your academic background for our audience?
Of course, yes.
Thank you.
Bom, pessoal, então alguns recadinhos em português para vocês. O professor Shaun vai fazer toda a palestra em inglês, né? Mas quem quiser fazer alguma pergunta em português, não tem problema, a gente traduz, tá? Para vocês, se vocês se sentirem confortáveis. Quem quiser fazer em inglês também, não há nenhum problema. A lista de chamada vai ser passada no final da palestra. Então, como de costume, a palestra também tem um certificado que vai ser enviado no final. Como a gente deu as boas-vindas em inglês, vou repetir aqui: boas-vindas a todos que estão nos assistindo. É realmente uma grande honra receber o professor Shaun aqui hoje, que vai falar um pouco sobre dinastia constantiniana para a gente, né? Então, assim, é uma oportunidade muito única para o GAT. Então, bem-vindos, muito obrigada pela audiência. Espero que seja uma manhã muito, muito produtiva para todos nós.
Obrigada, pessoal. Sejam muito bem-vindos. Agora eu vou ler o CV do professor, a súmula dele. Shaun é professor de História do Baixo Império Romano e Bizantino na School of History, Archaeology and Religion, da Cardiff University. Ele é bacharel em História Antiga e Estudos Bizantinos pela Queen's University Belfast e concluiu seu doutorado na University of St. Andrews, com foco no reinado de Leão VI. Os interesses de pesquisa do professor Tuffer incluem a política, a cultura de corte e as dinâmicas familiares dos impérios romano tardio e bizantino, com ênfase especial nas dinastias constantiniana e macedônica, bem como temas como mulheres imperiais, eunucos e sexualidade na antiguidade. Ele possui uma ampla produção publicada, incluindo livros como Julian the Apostate, The Eunuch in Byzantine History and Society, The Roman Castrati, Eunuchs in the Roman Empire. Seus trabalhos mais recentes são Core Life in Byzantine Constantinople, The Age of Macedonian Dynasty e o volume organizado Studies in Byzantine History and Culture, A Fast for Paul Magdaleno, ambos publicados em 2024. O professor Tuffer também orienta pesquisas de doutorado e mestrado sobre temas do Baixo Império Romano e Bizantino e leciona disciplinas de graduação e pós-graduação sobre o mundo antigo, o Império Bizantino e questões de gênero e sexualidade na Antiguidade. So, Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed. Excellent. So, well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak. It's a great pleasure to be connected with you all. And I hope you'll find it interesting. So one of the interests of my research is in families, and particularly royal or imperial families. And one family I've been particularly interested in is the Byzantine imperial family, the Macedonian dynasty. So I have a chapter in the book on the left, Approaches to the Byzantine Family. I've looked at that particular dynasty there. But I'm also interested in the Constantinian dynasty, and that's what I want to talk about today. I've written about aspects of the Constantinian family before. So the book on the right has a chapter on some members of the Constantinian family, sort of more neglected members of the family. But today I want to talk about grandparents specifically in the dynasty. So I want to establish the identities of known grandparents within the dynasty, both grandfathers and grandmothers, and both paternal and maternal grandparents, and think about what these cases reveal about the status and roles of grandparents in the dynasty, as well as what they suggest about ideas and ideals concerning grandparents in the period more generally. Before getting into sort of the meat of Constantinian grandparents, I just wanted to offer some initial reflections based on my previous work on the Macedonian dynasty, but also on my own family history. I think if you're studying families, it's kind of difficult not to think about your own situations when you're doing it. Because I think there's some interesting general questions come out of these reflections. So thinking about the Macedonian dynasty, it strikes me that most of the rulers of this family seem never to have experienced a living grandparent. And even if some did, there may be one or two, we've no information about the nature of the relationship they had with the grandparent. So there's a dearth of information there. And then thinking about my own case, both my grandfathers died before I was born, so I never had any relationship with a living grandfather. But both my grandmothers survived into my adulthood. So I did have relationships with them. But then another reflection comes to mind here, because you can have varying relationships with grandparents. So I was much closer to my maternal grandmother than to my paternal grandmother. So certain general questions then arise from these reflections. So how common was it to experience grandparents? How important were they in imperial families, if they did exist? And what individual variation was there in relationships with different grandparents? And whether they were a maternal or a paternal grandparent a factor? Did that make any difference in the nature of the relationships? Also, even if grandparents had predeceased grandchildren, what was the attitude to and engagement with them after their death, so that there can still be a connection made with deceased relatives? It's also important to think about current or previous research on Roman families in particular. And unfortunately, previous study of Roman grandparents has been quite limited. So for instance, Geoffrey Nathan's book, The Family in Late Antiquity from 2000, actually had very little to say about grandparents. But in that respect, it seems to have been quite typical. It's only more recently that grandparents have begun to attract significant research attention. So, for instance, a couple of articles on the screen there, one by Christian Leis from 2015 and one from Ville Vulanto from 2017. So you can see this quite recent work that's being produced. So in the case of Leis, his article was focused on an inscription on an altar in Rome commemorating a woman named Claudia Berus, who was alive in the mid-1st century AD and is identified both as a grandmother, Avia, and a wet nurse, a nutrix. And the altar was set up for her by her grandson and by a granddaughter. So Leis makes some interesting observations in the course of this article. He says grandparents are epigraphically only rarely attested, so we don't often see them in inscriptions, and that a general study on Roman grandparents is still lacking. So he himself talks about the lack of study of Roman grandparents. He dwells on issues of demography, comments on the role of grandparents, especially grandmothers, in the education of grandchildren. So turning to Vulanto's article, he's concerned specifically with grandmothers in Rome and Egypt. And he says he's interested in their roles, in the inner dynamics of households, and in the lives of their grandchildren. And he utilizes, in particular, documentary papyri from Oxyrhynchus from the 1st to the 6th century AD, so a much broader body of evidence than Lice was using. He uses also census documents for taxation and papyri beyond Oxyrhynchus as well. So he observes that while in the study of the Roman family, the caring or custodial role of grandmothers in the absence of parents is recognized, he says there's hardly any discussion of the role of grandparents in the everyday life of children. He asserts that it is possible to study the agency and compare the relative significance of different grandparents in the early lives of children. Like Lice, he comments on demographic patterns and remarks that only a minority of children had any chance of knowing their grandparents. He states that children were more likely to have a living maternal grandmother than a living paternal grandmother or maternal grandfather or a paternal grandfather, because of the different ages at which women and men tended to marry. He comments on patterns of cohabitation, so members of the family living together. On the roles played by grandmothers and grandfathers, he emphasizes their similarity rather than their difference. So sort of saying they've actually got more in common, the male and female grandparents. Widening his perspective from Egypt to the Roman Empire, he reflects, for grandparents in general, there was a special value in seeing their grandchildren grow up. Grandchildren meant the survival of the family and its traditions, security in old age, and the maintenance and continuity of the names and memories of the older generations. So there is clearly research beginning to burgeon, and this is also reflected by the fact that Lisa Brunet completed in 2022 a PhD on grandparents in the Roman Empire, the evidence of the Latin West. And she did this at the University of Manchester under the supervision of Christian Lice himself. So she makes the case that, you know, her PhD topic is a neglected one. Her time span, she sets at 200 BC to 400 AD. And she was very concerned also to make a comparison between ancient and modern grandparents. So she does make the connection to the modern day. That's part of what she's trying to do in her thesis. And part of her thesis focuses on imperial grandchildren and their grandparents. And she observes that the evidence for the relationship between them resembles the overall image that Latin literary texts portray, and that the reliance on the glory of ancestors in order to strengthen position was important for other Romans too. So they have things in common with sort of Roman families more generally. In her final conclusions, she remarks on the fact that grandmothers have tended to be the particular focus of attention. So poor Roman grandfathers, they're not getting enough attention. She emphasizes the importance of appreciating the varied realities of life. She is alert to the problem of stereotypes, but also sees that it is often difficult to break away from them, which is an inherent problem of the sources themselves. So grandparents can be talked about in very set ways. She acknowledges too that further work needs to be done, in particular looking at Greek sources as well as the Latin ones. She was particularly concerned about the Latin West. And she also says she'd like to look more at the Christian sources. You know, what is the impact of Christianity on sort of pagan or pre-Christian attitudes to family members? So that's a bit on the background of what the current study of Roman grandparents is. So my paper wants to kind of contribute to this development by focusing on a particular family, an imperial family, the Constantinians, as we've said, but bearing in mind the issues and concerns I've already touched on. Okay, so who are we talking about? So this is the list I've come up with of named grandparents, or some of them we don't even have their names, as you can see. Julian's maternal grandmother there in the list towards the bottom. We don't know her name, but we know she existed. Anyway, so these are the ones, and they're roughly in chronological order here. So Constantius I, who died in 306, Maximian, who died in 310, Eutropia died after the mid-320s, Helena died about 328, Theodora seems to have been dead by 337, Constantine I died in 337, Julian's maternal grandmother seems to have died some point after 337, we don't know exactly when. In addition to those ones, there is also the more problematic case of Claudius Gothicus. I've put him in there with a question mark. He died in 270. And he's a problematic case because we don't know his precise relationship with members of the Constantinian family, though some sources do assert that he was the grandfather of Constantine I. Not all the sources agree or even specify the relationship, but some do. So I will consider him as well. and we're dependent on a huge variety of types of sources, so histories, speeches, letters, inscriptions, coins, legislation. So anything where they're mentioned feeds into what I'm going to say. And I'll go through them one by one, considering grandfathers first, and then I'll turn to grandmothers. And then I'll come to my general conclusions at the end. Okay, so we're starting with Constantius I. And this is a sort of copy of a famous medallion, the Arras medallion, showing him as Caesar. And he'd become a Caesar in 293 as part of the Tetrarchy, and then he became Sol Augustus, or an Augustus, in 305. And he had children by two women, by Helena, who was the mother of the famous Constantine the Great. But he also had children by Theodora, who he married by 289. And they had many children together. So there was scope for him to become a grandparent because he did have children. But he died still sort of quite early on in his career in 306. So it seems that it was only offspring of his son Constantine that he could have been a living grandfather to. And Constantine had a son, Crispus, born in about 300. So he could have known and had a relationship with Crispus. But we know nothing about their relationship while Constantius was alive. But we can say his status as a grandfather was commemorated and celebrated after his death. So, for instance, there's a milestone inscription from Britain dating between 317 and 326, which does identify Crispus as Caesar and as grandson of the deified Constantius. Also, the sons of Constantine who were born after their grandfather Constantius's death could also be associated with his memory. So even the ones who couldn't have had any personal relationship with him, he is invoked in inscriptions and sources about them. So, for instance, in Eusebius's Life of Constantine, dated to about 337, Eusebius asserts that Constantius II was named after his grandfather. And later on, the status of Constantius I as the grandfather of Constantius II is also emphasized by Julian in both the panegyrics he wrote about Constantius II in the 350s. So in the 350s, this family relationship is still being held up as important. So regarding the identity of Constantius I as a grandfather, the evidence that survives dates to after his death, and features in evocations of him as a distinguished imperial ancestor of imperial grandsons. So this indicates that the concern with him as a grandfather is not about a necessarily emotional, close personal family bond, but about practical issues of power and legitimacy, and about dynastic inheritance. The fact that he is not mentioned in relation to granddaughters is important to recognize, and this underscores this point, this dynastic aspect point, because female members did not rule directly. So he's naturally mentioned in relation to grandsons rather than granddaughters. Also interesting is Julian's own engagement with Constantius I as his grandfather, after he succeeded Constantius II as sole Augustus in 361. In his famous satire, The Caesars, Julian emphasizes that Constantius I was his grandfather when he's named as a member of the Tetrarchy, when the four emperors who constituted it enter the banquet of the gods. And Julian says, Diocletian advanced in pomp, bringing with him the two Maximians and my grandfather, Constantius. So Julian's very explicit about that relationship. And then further on, Julian notes the admiration of the gods for the tetrarchs. He says the gods admired their unanimity and permitted them to sit far in front of many of their predecessors. So Julian claims Constantius I as his grandfather and presents him positively. And it may be that for Julian, Constantius I had even more dynastic significance than he had for Constantius II. Julian's father had never been an emperor, whereas his cousin Constantius I, his father, of course, had been an emperor. So Julian maybe was attracted to Constantius I because this was an imperial ancestor. So that could be a factor as well. But more than that, Constantius I has a particular religious significance for Julian because he represented the pagan past of the family, and Julian himself famously, converted back to paganism. And Julian does make this explicit in the Caesars too. He says the gods were favorable to the family because Constantius and also Claudius Gothicus had been pagans, so they're willing to support the family despite some of them converting to Christianity. So for Julian, Constantius I had value as a grandfather, not just for his imperial status, but also for his religious identity as a fellow pagan. So that's Constantius I. So I want to turn to Maximian, and this is a coin from the mid-290s from Trier, this particular one. And Maximian, he also was part of the Tetrarchy, and he was the Augustus to Constantius I, who was his Caesar. So they have a connection directly in the West. And by his wife Eutropia, Maximian had children, Maxentius and Fausta, possibly Theodora as well, though she might have been a stepdaughter of Maximian. So there was scope for him also to become a grandfather when these children had children of their own. Now, Fausta had not had any children by the time of her father's death in 310, but Maxentius had two sons by his wife Valeria Maximilla, and we know that one of them, Romulus, was definitely alive during Maximian's lifetime, although he died in 309, so a year before his grandfather died. But the other, whose name we don't know, is just testified as being alive in 312. So possibly he was born after the death of his grandfather, but we don't know for sure. As for Theodora, she had many children. She had 8 children by her husband Constantius I. but we hear nothing about Maximian's relations with any grandchildren before his death. Possibly his strained relationships with both his son Maxentius and his son-in-law Constantine in the period 306 to 310 may have impeded the development of close relationships with grandchildren. As with the case of Constantius I, the evidence for Maximian being invoked as grandfather comes in the wake of his death. So it's after his death that we get it being talked about. So an inscription in Rome commemorating the deceased Romulus, the deceased grandson, dating to 311 to 312, describes him as the grandson of both the deified Maximian and the deified Galerius. So that was the father of his mother, Valeria Maximilla. Also, interestingly, Maximian's memory was actually quickly rehabilitated under Constantine I. And there are a series of coins minted around 318, 319, where Constantine commemorates, deceased ancestors. This one on the screen is a coin commemorating his own father, Constantius I. But he did also mint coins commemorating Maximian and also Claudius Gothicus, who we'll come on to. So the coins aren't specific in naming them as grandparents, but the timing, I think, is significant because it was in 317 that both Crispus and Constantine II were made Caesars. So even though the coins don't spell it out, that could have been part of the thinking, these grandfathers, important ancestors being commemorated. But it's inscriptions that spell out the relationship specifically. And this is sort of early 17th century tapestry, a series of tapestries designed by Rubens, illustrating the history of Constantine. This one I've just put up because it shows in relation to Maximian, it's showing the marriage of his daughter Fausta to Constantine, as well as another marriage, but we don't need to get into that. So he was, the grandfather of the children of Constantine and Fausta. So a statue base for Constantine II identifies him as the grandson of the deified Maximian. And Rebecca Usherwood has asserted that Maximian was used to legitimize the Constantinian Caesar. So he has particular relevance for his grandsons, their own status. And this strategy continues on into their own reigns. So we get other inscriptions which refer to this relationship. So there's a milestone from Sirmium for Constantius II. He's identified as the grandson of both Maximian and Constantius I. So both grandparents are mentioned there, grandfathers. And Julian, again, going to Julian, in his panegyrics on Constantius II, he does celebrate Maximian as the grandfather of his cousin, and he too treats him as a pair with Constantius's paternal grandfather, Constantius I. So this pairing of Constantius I and Maximian is interesting, these grandfathers, maternal and paternal. So that is something we see in the sources. So in the first panegyric, when addressing the ancestry of Constantius II, Julian says, I'm at a loss where to begin. For all your ancestors, grandfathers, parents, brothers, cousins, and kinsfolk were emperors. And Julian gives a very positive image of both grandfathers as good and worthy members of the Tetrarchy. He emphasizes that they had filial piety towards Diocletian, talks about their military achievements and their unanimity together, and the latter being evidenced by this marriage between Constantine and Fausta, so the two men cementing their relationship through the marriage of their children. And in the second panegyric, Julian asserts the supremacy of the family, saying it began in earnest when your two grandfathers succeeded to the throne. So he does dwell on the two of them together. He says, your mother's father, well, that's Maximian, governed Rome and Italy and Libya besides, and Sardinia and Sicily. Your father's father, meaning Constantius, ruled the most warlike of all the tribes of Galatia, the Western Iberians, and the islands that lie in the ocean. So, as in the case of Constantius I, the memory of Maximian as a grandfather was invoked after his death as a way of enhancing and justifying the status of his grandsons. The case of Maximian has a further dimension, though. He was invoked as maternal grandfather for the sons of Constantine and Fausta, but also as paternal grandfather for the son of Maxentius. So we can see that side of the family as well. Also worth commenting on the fact that Julian himself does not dwell on his own relationship with Maximian, even though Maximian was his great-grandfather. Julian doesn't say anything about this. He's content in the panegyrics on Constantius II to dwell on him there as the grandfather of his cousin. But when Julian became sole emperor, going to the Caesars, that text again, he reviled Maximian. He attacked him as grossly intemperate. He wasn't allowed to join the emperors at the feast. He indulged in vicious passions. He was meddlesome. He was disloyal. So he was banished by justice. And Julian says, I don't know where he went after that. So Julian's own attitude when he is sole emperor is very hostile. So Julian in the Caesars, he is concerned to claim Constantius I as his paternal grandfather, and he has no need to claim Maximian II, and it might have actually been useful to deploy a negative image of Maximian to attack his dead cousins, because Maximian was their maternal grandfather. So it might have been actually quite a useful strategy for Julian to attack Maximian in the Caesars. So in the case of Julian, we can see that a grandparent could also be disowned. You might not want to claim a grandparent, and you could also use them as a weapon against other family members. So that's a different kind of strategy we're seeing in relation to the use of grandparents. Okay, so coming to Constantine himself, it's a medallion. I think there's some debate about the dating, but traditionally dated to 326. That's when he's become sole Augustus. And Constantine, he did have several children, and most of them, all but one of them, was by Fausta. And it was expected that he would become a grandfather. And this is actually mentioned in a panegyric for Constantine delivered in Rome in 321 by the rhetorician Nazarius. So this expectation that his own children will have children of their own is mentioned. So this speech mentions Constantine's Caesars, who were Crispus and Constantine II, and their brothers. And like Nazarius declares, Rome wishes for your children, greatest Constantine, for your children and your grandchildren afterward, with you, that the greater your reputations, the more men will entreat you. So there is this kind of positioning of yearning for the future of the dynasty to continue through grandchildren there. But I mean, given that the eldest son of Constantine and Fausta, Constantine II, had only been born in 316, the expectation of grandchildren from that branch of the family lay far in the future, and indeed no children are known to have been born to Constantine's sons and daughters by Fausta before his death in 337. But Crispus, his son by Minervina, was a different matter. And in 322, we know that Crispus and his wife Helena did have a child. So Constantine did become a grandfather during the lifetime of Crispus. And we know this from a constitution of Constantine that's been preserved in the Theodosian Code from the 5th century. And we're told that this constitution was received in Rome on the 30th of October 322 and addressed to Maximus, the prefect of Rome, the city prefect. And Constantine declares, because of the birth of a child to Crispus and Helena, we pardon all criminals except sorcerers, homicides, and adulterers. So this sort of bit of information that's been preserved in the Theodosian Code shows that clearly the birth of a grandchild to Constantine was seen as a cause for celebration. And perhaps this was not just for dynastic reasons, but for human sentiment as well. Okay, so now we come to Claudius Gothicus. I mean, I've mentioned him a few times, and this is sort of a more problematic case, as I said earlier. And sources do claim him as an ancestor of the family. And the famous attestation of this, perhaps the first attestation, comes in a panegyric to Constantine in 310 in Trier. And the orator says, I'm going to begin the speech with the divinity who is the origin of your family, of whom most people perhaps are unaware. And he says, this is Claudius, the deified emperor, Claudius. And it praises the achievements of this Roman emperor. And this is, quite a famous piece of evidence. It's seen as part of Constantine's efforts to bolster his own legitimacy and superiority to rivals by claiming descent from an emperor who had ruled before Diocletian had come to power, so a pre-existing claim to imperial status. Now, this panegyric, it doesn't spell out what the relationship is. It says, obviously there's some family relationship, but it doesn't say precisely what the connection is. And some other sources are very vague as well, but some sources do say so. We get that in an inscription from Rome and also a lost inscription from Ravenna. So there are pieces of evidence which do claim that this is a grandfather of Constantine. So clearly there was some uncertainty about the exact nature of the relationship. But that makes it even more interesting that some sources do, nail their flag to the mast and say he's a grandfather. They're choosing to spell out the grandfatherly nature of the relationship. So it's a deliberate choice some sources are making there. And it could apply to Constantine's own sons as well. They could be celebrated as grandchildren of Claudius. We see that on milestones and inscriptions as well. So it is used in relation to Constantine's own children as well. So they're described as either as great-grandsons or great-great-grandsons. So some kind of grandfatherly relationship is imagined by some sources. Okay, so those are the grandfathers. So I'm going to turn to the grandmothers, and in some ways, the grandmothers are, even more interesting, as hopefully we'll see. So the first one, obviously, is Helena. Helena is very famous in her own right as the mother of Constantine and as Augusta. And unlike her husband, partner, Constantius I, Helena lived longer. She lived into the 320s, so she did live long enough to know her grandchildren. the children of Constantine and Fausta. In addition to knowing Crispus, she obviously knew Crispus as well. So Helena, it's thought she died in about 328. She's prominent from 318 as Nobilissima Femina, and then famously she became Augusta in 324. And she does have particular dynastic significance because she was the surviving parent of Constantine himself. And her dynastic significance is emphasized in inscriptions which were put up when she was still alive. So Hexter, for instance, notes that Helena was named as Mater, Genetrix, Procreatrix of Constantine, and grandmother of his sons on a number of Latin inscriptions. So a statue base in Salernum from the 320s identifies Augusta Helena as wife of the deified Constantius, mother of Constantine the Augustus, and grandmother of the Caesars Crispus, Constantine, and Constantius. And one from Rome, dating to slightly later in the 320s, identifies her as mother of Constantine and grandmother of the Caesars, Constantine II and Constantius II. So she too is being sort of claimed as this important ancestor, but a living one at the time of these inscriptions. The association with grandsons features also in other texts, dating to after her death. In his Life of Constantine, Eusebius records that Helena, when she was approaching death, she made her last will in favor of her only son Constantine, but also his sons, the Caesars, her own grandchildren, the text says, bequeathing to each of her issue part of her estate, everything she possessed in the whole world. So Eusebius's remarks serve to support the legitimacy of Helena's grandsons as her heirs, but also as the sanctioned colleagues and then heirs of Constantine. She's also associated with Crispus in later texts. There's the very famous story preserved in Zosimus about the execution of Crispus in the 320s. And Helena is described as being very saddened by the death of Crispus, inconsolable at the young man's death, and this leads to Constantine then killing Fausta as well. So this story about the grief of Helena conjures up something different to what we've seen in the other sources so far, a sense of a close emotional bond between grandmother and grandson. So a different kind of image we're getting in that text in Zosimus. Okay, so in addition to Helena, we also have Theodora. And Theodora is very interesting to consider in relation to Helena because she was a wife of Constantius I too, as we've seen, and she had several children with Constantius, and most of those went on to have children of their own. So she was a grandmother several times over. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of information about her life, so we don't know if she was alive when any of these grandchildren were born. And it's thought that coins, which were minted in 337, on which she appears, indicate that she's already dead by the time of the minting of those coins. So when she died is very unclear. But these coins seem very interesting to me. So given that we've got so little information about her, the fact that we then find her being put on coins in 337 to 340 seems remarkable, especially as the coins of Theodora form a pair with a type celebrating Helena as well, who was a much more visible figure and had only died around 328. And these coins, these bronze coins, were minted, it seems, under Constantine II, Constantius II, and Constans, so just after the death of Constantine the Great. So they seem to be deliberately commemorating their grandmother Helena and their step-grandmother Theodora, though again the legends do not spell out the nature of the family relationship. And we know the coins were struck at mints in Trier, in Rome, and Constantinople, so the three key centers in the different parts of the empire that the sons share between them. So on the coins for Theodora, the legend is for Flavia Maxima Theodora Augusta, and we have her bust in profile. And we also have on the reverse Roman piety as the legend, and an image depicting Pietas holding a baby on her left arm and her right breast with her right hand. So that's the Theodora type. And then we have the Helena type as well. And the legend for that is for Flavia Julia Helena Augusta. And we've got her bust in profile again. And on the reverse, we have a different legend and personification to Theodora's. We've got Pax Publica, and the image is Pax, standing, looking left, holding a lowered branch and a transverse scepter. And in both busts, Theodora and Helena are depicted facing right. They've got diadems, they've got elaborate dressed hair, and they're wearing mantles and necklaces. So these coins clearly are meant to be taken together. So the similarities between how the women are depicted and the different personifications that each has. Now, these coins are a source of debate because given the date of the minting, 337 to 340, it seems that these are being minted at the time of the Great Massacre of 337, like the killings within the family after the death of Constantine the Great in May of that year. So several of Theodora's male descendants were killed at this time, and Julian is a key source for this. He says 9 of his relatives were killed at this time: his own father, Julius Constantius, and his eldest son, his uncle Dalmatius, and his sons, the Caesar Dalmatius and Hannibalianus, the king of kings and of the Pontic people, and 4 other unidentifiable cousins were killed as well. So when you think about it, 7 grandsons of Theodora were killed in 337. And this was at the instigation or acceptance of her step-grandsons, probably primarily, if not solely, Constantius II, in order to secure the succession. So people sort of think, well, in this context of dynastic tension, why are these coins being minted? It seems sort of like very difficult to understand. Some people have seen them as a reflection of the tensions, the dynastic tensions themselves. Some have seen them as related specifically to the Great Massacre. I find it very hard to accept these views, like sort of these ostensibly positive coins. You know, what could be the connection of these terrible family events? It seems far more likely to me that the coins were designed as a pair in order to celebrate the twin-branched nature of the imperial family. And we know that Constantine I, that was his plan in the 330s. He was trying to bring both sides of the family together and to promote both sides. So the coins seem to me to fit more into that idea, the celebration of the grandmother and the step-grandmother in very similar imagery together. So that seems to me more likely. And Kent himself, in the 1980s, he thought regarding the coinage, he said the harmonious joint succession of the two families may have been the connotation originally intended. So there was an original intention, which then seems odd. given what happened within the family. And I think the fact that they choose to focus on the two grandmothers is interesting. It's an effective visual way of showing the double branch nature of the family tree. So if they just shown Constantius I on his own, that wouldn't really have conveyed the double branched nature of the family well, if at all. So it's, the grandmothers are serving a very specific purpose, I think, by being shown. And I think it's also significant that Theodora, she's named as Augusta on the coin, but we don't know that she held that title during her lifetime. So they seem to want to make, deliberate symmetry between these two women. They're both called Augusta on these coins. So the grandmothers are kind of mirroring each other in these coinage. Okay. So just a couple more grandmothers to go before I reach the conclusion. So Eutropia, this bust, this fragment's been identified as a depiction of Eutropia from a villa in southwest France. And again, there's, like Theodora, there's very limited evidence about Eutropia. I mean, she was the wife of Maximian. We know she had children with him, Maxentius and Fausta, possibly Theodora as well. And she did become a grandmother numerous times. And Eutropia is interesting because she's related to both branches of the family, because her daughter, Theodora, was married to Constantius I, and her other daughter, Fausta, was married to Constantine I. So she's got grandchildren on both branches of the Constantinian family tree. We do know, however, that Eutropia was alive in the 320s. Unlike Theodora, we're not sure. Eutropia definitely was alive in the 320s. Eusebius mentions her in his Life of Constantine. He talks about Eutropia writing to Constantine in the mid-320s, and he preserves a letter of Constantine himself recording that his most saintly mother-in-law had reported pagan practices at Mamre in letters to him. So Eutropia was definitely alive after several of her grandchildren had been born. So it's possible she had personal relationships with them, but we don't know when she died. Interestingly, Julian refers to her later on as well in his first panegyric on the Emperor Constantius II, when he talks about his cousins Patras. He says there were claims by various cities and peoples, including the Easterners. And Julian says the Easterners say that they sent forth your grandmother to be the consort of your grandfather on the mother's side. So clearly this is referring to Eutropia marrying Maximian. Interestingly, again, as with the case of Maximian, Julian makes no claim of ancestry for himself with Eutropia, even though she was his father's maternal grandmother. And interestingly, Julian never even alludes to Theodora in his writings as his paternal grandmother. Julian seems to be just concerned with his descent from his paternal grandfather, Constantius I. That's a key thing for him, and by extension with Claudius Gothicus as well. Okay, so I come to my last case of a grandparent, another grandmother. This image, this is obviously not an image of Julian's maternal grandmother, but it's kind of symbolic, I think, of how she is talked about by some academics. This kind of stereotypical idea of the caring elderly grandmother. So this photograph is kind of tapping into that idea, that stereotype, as we'll see when we look at some of the comments shortly. So Julian does mention a grandmother in one of his letters. And he's writing to his friend Evagrius, who was a fellow pagan, and he's writing to gift him an estate which Julian's grandmother had gifted to him. So he's passing on this gift that he'd had himself. And he says about the estate, a small estate of 4 fields in Bithynia was given to me by my grandmother, and this I give as an offering to your affection for me. And Julian conjures up a very idyllic image of the place which he'd known since boyhood. He says, when I was still hardly more than a boy, I thought that this was the most delightful summer place. And he adds that when he was older, he both fondly remembered his time there and continued to visit it. When I had grown to manhood, I used to long for my old manner of life there and visited it often, and our meetings there did not lack talks about literature. So this is the famous mention of his grandmother. He also mentions property of his grandmother in a letter to a priest. He says, my grandmother's estate was kept from me untouched, though others had taken possession of it by violence. Now, this grandmother that he's referring to is thought to be his maternal grandmother, the wife of Julius Julianus, who'd been the praetorian prefect of Licinius. And she'd had 2 children with her husband, Basilina, which was Julian's mother, and Julian, which was Julian's uncle. And Julian was born to Basilina and Julius Constantius in Constantinople around 331 or 332, though his mother died very soon afterwards. And then Julian's father was one of the victims of the Great Massacre in 337. So it's in these difficult family circumstances that Julian's maternal grandmother is thought to have come to the fore. Julian places his visits to his grandmother's property in his early boyhood. So these could have occurred after the death of Basilina, but before the killing of Julius Constantius, though some date the visits to after the events of 337. It's possible, I think, that he visited it before 337 and afterwards. The fact that he's got such fond memories might suggest he's thinking of the pre-337 phase. In either case, the maternal side of Julian's family seemed to have played a pronounced part in his care in his youth. Not only is there connection with his maternal grandmother's property, but also Julian says after his 7th year, he was handed over to the eunuch Mardonius, who became his paedagogos, his tutor, and this was a role the eunuch had played for Julian's own mother, Basilina, and this eunuch had been brought up under the patronage of Julian's maternal grandfather, Julius Julianus, for this purpose. Further, we know that, according to Ammianus, Eusebius, the bishop of Nicomedia, who seems to have had some role in Julian's early upbringing, was a relative, according to Ammianus, as I've said. And it's possible that Eusebius was even the brother of Julian's maternal grandmother. So he might have been quite a close relative. Now, there's been a certain tendency in modern mentions of this maternal grandmother of Julian to idealize her and her relationship with her grandson. Most arresting is Browning's verdict. Browning said that she was a kindly and warm-hearted woman who devoted much care and tenderness to the young orphan. But Browning wasn't the only one who kind of went down this route. Bede himself talked about her, talked about this great lady, rich and influential, happy to find in her grandson the memory of a child who had died too soon, meaning Basilina. So she became attached to Julian, naturally, in her old age, cherishing, this young member of the family, this connection with her dead daughter. Bowersock says similar things. He says Julian was turned over to the gentle ministrations of his maternal grandmother in Bithynia. Athanasiadi also talks about the significance of the grandmother as well. And she says, the memory of this boyish happiness must have remained with the old lady. When she died, she left her estate to Julian. So this kind of idea of the kindly, caring old lady who's like, attached to Julian because, the difficult circumstances of the death of her daughter. Now, it's quite sobering then to realize that such verdicts are just based on Julian's letter to Evagrius about the estate. But in the letter, Julian says nothing about his grandmother's character or his relationship with her. So he doesn't talk about that. Julian's focus is on the estate itself, his experiences of it as a boy and as an adult, and of his friendship with Evagrius. So Evagrius is the friend he's thinking about. He calls Evagrius his dear heart. His grandmother is just described as his grandmother. There's no qualification given at all. Now, of course, Julian's fondness for the place and the memories it holds, and the fact that he wants to gift it to a special friend, as his grandmother had gifted it to him, might suggest something of his relationship with her, but it is only suggestive. He does not spell it out himself. So perhaps modern responses to Julian's connection with his maternal grandmother say more about modern ideals and expectations of relations between grandparents and grandchildren. Okay, so I'm just coming to my conclusions now. So again, this is just a photograph found online, kind of summing up kind of modern perceptions of grandparents with these older members of the family looking after the younger generation there. So I've focused on the evidence for grandparents in an imperial family in the later Roman Empire, and it's the Constantinian Dynasty. 8 cases of grandparents were examined, consisting of both grandfathers and grandmothers, both paternal and maternal, and including great-grandparents and step-grandparents, and even one case of an apparently invented grandfather. As might be expected, much of the evidence available for study was concerned with ancestry in relation to power and legitimacy. Imperial families were obviously concerned to emphasize their right to rule, and one way to do this was to specify how far into the past this claim stretched. In addition, they were keen for their imperial status and power to pass on to their descendants, and thus the advent or anticipation of grandchildren could be celebrated and hoped for. Such claims are naturally found in sources which sought to praise rulers, such as panegyrics and inscriptions and visual images too. It's well known that Romans were generally concerned with ancestry in relation to status, and with imperial families, this was even more imperative. In terms of personal relationships between grandparents and grandchildren when both were living, the evidence was more scarce. While with most of the cases of grandparents considered, it was seen that their lives did at least have some overlap with those of grandchildren, much of the evidence was about the relationship after the death of the grandparent, or even after the death of both grandparent and grandchild. This underlines further the fact that the evidence tended to be concerned with issues of power and legitimacy, but it also reveals that these relationships had meaning, even if it was not based on close experience. Some of the evidence, however, opened up windows to the personal and emotional aspects of relationships between grandparents and grandchildren, even if there were the shadows of ideal and stereotype. There was Constantine's celebration of the birth of a grandchild, recorded in legal evidence, and Helena's grief at the death of her grandson Crispus, narrated in historiography. A celebrated case in modern commentary is that of the affection for and care of Julian by his maternal grandmother, but as seen, this was built on limited and flimsy evidence. and seems to reveal more about modern ideals of relationships between grandparents and grandchildren. The evidence could also highlight the very particular circumstances in which some relationships between grandparents and grandchildren could become more pronounced. For instance, as the surviving parent of Constantine, Helena took on emphatic dynastic significance in the 320s, being celebrated in inscriptions as Augusta and paternal grandmother of the Caesars. And in relation to Julian, his maternal grandmother seems to have had a more prominent part to play after his mother's death, soon after his birth, and then after the killing of his father in 337. Interestingly, both Helena and Julian's maternal grandmother are associated with bequeathing inheritances to their grandsons. While both paternal and maternal grandparents are revealed to have significance for grandchildren as important ancestors, carers, and benefactors, one striking element to emerge from the evidence is the lack of mention of granddaughters. It is grandsons that dominate. In part, this again reflects the purpose of much of the evidence, the assertion and celebration of imperial power and legitimacy. The focus is grandsons, as granddaughters would not rule. Thus, there is a gender dimension to be considered in regard to the nature of relationships between grandparents and grandchildren, even if grandmothers themselves could have dynastic capital. Witness the case of Helena, but also those of Eutropia and Theodora. Some other important and more particular aspects about the meaning of grandparents for grandchildren emerge from the evidence in relation to Julian. The case of Julian reveals that grandparents could be valuable not just as distinguished imperial ancestors, but for other qualities too, in this instance, the paganism of Constantius I and Claudius Gothicus. Further, it is demonstrated that grandchildren might want to distance themselves from some grandparents. In Julian's case, his rejection of Maximian for his own political purposes. Thus, more individual factors could come into play in how and why, and indeed if, grandparents were remembered. Overall, then, despite the high-profile nature of the imperial family, there can still be limitations to the amount of information preserved about grandparents. What does survive mostly reflects familiar aspects, such as their significance as regards the importance of ancestry, issues of inheritance, and questions about the likelihood of grandchildren knowing living grandparents. There also surfaced the subject of the roles of both grandfathers and grandmothers, both paternal and maternal, in education and caring, though one would like to know more about this and also about the emotional bonds that might exist. And here there arose the potential danger of overreading the evidence and imposing modern assumptions. What strikes one as of particular interest are the political importance that could be attached to grandmothers, the invisibility of granddaughters, and the individual reasons why the memory of a grandparent might be embraced or disowned. Ultimately, for our knowledge of grandparents, we depend very much on the voices of the children and grandchildren. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Shaun. It's a great honor to learn from you. It was certainly a morning full of learning for all of us. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor, for sharing your research with us. And then now we would like to open the floor for questions from the audience. If anyone has a question, please feel free to ask in English or Portuguese. We can help with translation if needed. So we have a question here, and I will translate.
All right, just a minute. Okay. Just a minute, sorry. Do we have any evidence of personal or political relationships between Elena and her grandsons, especially Constantius II or Constance?
Um, Unfortunately, we don't, I think. I mean, Constance sort of is born a bit later anyway, isn't he? So certainly Constantine the second is the eldest, and then Constantius the second. So she was alive when they were born. The evidence we have, I mean, she's mentioned in those inscriptions in relation to the grandsons, but we don't have anything. I mean, this is one of the frustrating things. So this lack of the personal connection between the family members. I mean, there's, as I said, there's the famous story about her and Crispus, which, you know, wherever this story comes from, you know, suggests, you know, this idea of, you know, a close relationship between a grandmother and a grandson. I mean, Helena, she was important. You know, she has great significance and status. She seems to be useful to Constantine for, you know, developing relations with the elite in Rome. We know she's based in Rome, but then she also goes to the eastern provinces, so she seems to have some political function there. So presumably she was engaging with her son and his family. But yeah, it's just sort of this frustrating lack of detail we have about, you know, what's going on in terms of their personal connections and maybe more day to day, you know, life within the imperial family. I mean, occasionally we get glimpses of things on ceremonial occasions, for instance, or stories, as we've seen. But yeah, no, it's frustrating. I mean, I don't know whether Thais has anything, you know, to comment on there.
Sorry. The next question. Could we see Julian's emphasis on Constantius Chlorus as an attempt to revive a pure pre-Christian Constantinian identity?
I would say definitely. I mean, I think that's a key thing Julian is trying to do. You know, he's very keen on the connection with Constantius I and Claudius Gothicus. I think he's very aware, you know, his view of what happened to the family in terms of their religious history, like going off the rails spectacularly with Constantine and Constantine's conversion and the conversion of the sons as well. So I think definitely he has that in mind. I mean, obviously Julian, you know, he's much more educated than his ancestors, so he probably would have had a very different approach to intellectual religion compared to Constantius I would think. But he definitely does utilize it in his writings, his interest in Helios. You know, this seems to be, you know, maybe harking back to an attachment earlier on that the family had. You know, Constantine's own apparent interest in Apollo. We know about that as well. So I think it does fit in to how Julian is presenting himself as getting back, you know, getting the family back on track, into the right track in terms of religion. But I do think, you know, obviously he's coming from a completely different Neoplatonic perspective on religion as well. So he's got his own character, I think, in terms of what he thinks is important about religion. But I mean, Constantius I, it's very interesting how he's written about by Christian authors as well. You know, they obviously, it's obviously a delicate subject in some ways. You know, this is the father of Constantine. You know, so, and they kind of imply that he's kind of a Christian, or he's like a Christian already. You know, even before the conversion of Constantine. But they certainly praise him in other ways. So the attitude to Constantius I think, is one of the interesting things not just from Julian's point of view, but from from Christian authors' points of view as well. So he's a very interesting figure, I think, in how he is handled, in his memory, how it's handled generally. I hope that.
Thank you.
Okay, next question. Doesn't the figure of Julian's maternal uncle Julian further inform our views on his grandmother? Gallus had a different grandmother and became a Christian while Julian was Julian.
Hello, Gabriel. I hope you're well. I don't know. I mean, the Uncle Julian is very interesting. I mean, I've written about him elsewhere. Yes, and he does become part of the regime of Julian. So yeah, yes. I mean, there is that interesting dimension there too. I mean, we don't know so much about that relationship between, you'd think we'd know more about her relationship with her own son, but that's not really mentioned, I think. But yes, I think it certainly would be a way of thinking about the memory of her as well, and the connection of Julian with her son. Yes, Gallus. I'm thinking about Gallus now. Gallus had a different grandmother. He did, and a different mother, of course. Yeah. I mean, Gallus is another very interesting member of the family. So I'm just trying to think about how he fits into this picture. I mean, Julian and he have this kind of shared relationship. Obviously, his own mother, died before Julian's. That was Julius Constantius' first wife, so she's already died. But we know a bit about when he was born, where he was, his later political career. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure I'd see it in such a black and white way in terms of religion there. But I think that's useful for me to think about. Thank you for raising it as another dimension to think about the family relationships.
Well, thank you. The next question is mine. I have tons of questions, but I've selected just two. The first is, do you think Helena's image as a Christian matriarch was a posthumous construction, or was it actively cultivated during her lifetime?
Yes. Well, if we take the Christian bit out of it, she's definitely been constructed as a matriarch. There's no doubt about that. So she is basically the creator of this dynasty. That becomes the message we see in the inscriptions and stuff. I mean, obviously Eusebius is very keen to emphasize the Christian aspect, the Christian nature of Constantine and Helena. But in terms of her trip to the eastern provinces, I think there's been a move away from seeing that as pilgrimage, as you know, I'm sure, and seeing it more as part of the political strategy of what Constantine is up to. And certainly her political role in Rome, the connections she's making in Rome, how she helps the family by having this Constantinian presence in Rome. But she does move around, and in Trier as well, of course. So I think the answer depends on what you think about Constantine. Do you see him as this kind of genuine Christian convert, and the mother is also involved in this project, or do we have a more open mind about well, he's just trying to bring the Christians on board, and that's just one part of his strategies. Yes, so certainly Eusebius likes to over-Christianize everything, but I guess Barnes would say that's because that was the reality. You know, he's reflecting the reality. I have my suspicions. I have my doubts. I think she's clearly politically significant for Constantine and for the family, and she does create this very powerful precedent about how an empress can fit into the family and the role she can play within it. You know, making her Augusta is very significant, but even before that, she clearly has status already. I mean, I guess what we'd really like to know is, well, what was she doing, you know, after Constantius, you know, married Theodora, had all these other children, and then Helena reemerges later on. Yes. What do you think? Do you think that this was part of the construction during her lifetime?
I think it's a combination of
Yeah.
both things. Like,
Mhm.
if she was really, really Christian, she was trying to be this Christian matriarch, right?
Mm.
So it is also amplified. It was amplified after her death for the posthumous authors. I think
Yeah.
that's it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Anna has a question too.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, the next question is
Well.
mine. So I would like to know, how do you interpret the ambiguities in Constantine religious stance, given
Yeah.
that they maintain pagan practice even after the Edict of Milan, right?
Yeah.
So does this suggest a strategic transition to Christianity or a deliberate foreign syncrasies? I recall reading about his positive response to a request from a city of Spello. We proposed renaming the city in honor of his family and had a festival, etc. So it's very interesting, but I would like to know your opinion about that.
Yeah. I mean, I think I think he was, you know, I think he did convert. I think he was a Christian, but then I also think, you know, we need to be careful about over reading, you know, why he does certain things. I mean, I think he's clearly supporting Christians, supporting the Christian church, but I think he's also conscious that, you know, not everybody is a Christian. But yes, his attitude to blood sacrifice, you know, he's obviously not keen on that. You know, I think there's some question about the dating of that temple being built. You know, was that during his reign, or maybe was that later on now? But generally, I tend to see him as being, you know, he's got his own views. You know, he's got his own attachments. But I don't read everything he does in the light of his Christianity. So the foundation of Constantinople, I mean, I don't see any reason to think that that's, you know, there's any Christian dimension to the building up of the city. You know, it seems entirely traditional to me, and I think it would be completely unrealistic to to see it as like a purely Christian foundation. I don't see that going on there. I was going to say something else now. What I was going to say about his attitudes. Yeah, and his legislation, for instance, you know, people talk about that. So the whole issue of the soothsayers, you know, his concerns about that is entirely traditional. It's more about political issues than anything religious there. You know, he clearly has some connections with sort of leading pagan figures as well, philosophers. So I think he's kind of operating in a world where he has his own attachments, but I don't think he necessarily is wanting to change things overnight for everybody. I think the oration to the saints is interesting. I've been reading a bit about that and reading that text and thinking about that. So his kind of commitment, I think there is a sense of commitment from Constantine, like a personal commitment to the religion. So I think we do see that. Yeah, so I don't know if that I don't know if that answers your question. I kind of tend to see him as, yes, obviously he's promoting Christianity. He is a Christian, but then I have limitations in understanding what he's up to. I don't see it as part of a whole plan to turn the empire Christian quickly. So, but then obviously he's concerned about educating his own children. Other members of the family seem to have become Christians, so maybe there is a sense that the family is expected to follow in his track. So maybe we're back to the Helena question again. The connection of her role within this as well. Yeah, I mean, basically, it's very complicated. I don't think there are easy answers. At least I don't find the answers easy. I'm very suspicious of, or very wary of Barnes's view of Constantine, that we understand everything through the lens of his attachment to Christianity. I wouldn't go that far.
Thank you so much.
What do you think?
I think it's complicated too.
Yeah.
I think it's a combination of strategy and political things more than religious.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I think it depends. It depends on our evidence, doesn't it? I mean, if we had, more historiography, contemporary historiography, we might get a better sense of what's going on. And I mean,
completely.
Yeah. So there were contemporary.
I think the fault of Constantine super Christian is fault of contemporary historiography. Absolutely.
Yeah. No, I think it's a very interesting area because he has like good connections with I suppose what we would call pagan people, but traditional Greco-Roman people. So yes, his links with people in Athens I think is very interesting. So I think he, in some ways he's kind of got an open attitude to his dealings with people, I think.
Thank you so much, Professor Shaun.
Thank you.
So we have time for one last question. My question. As you know, I'm very interested in imperial women. So my question is, given Fausta's central position as the mother of Constantine's heirs and daughter of Maximian, how do we interpret this silence or ambivalence in later sources regarding her legacy?
Yeah, well, that's another big question, isn't it? Yes, I mean, obviously something went wrong. We don't know precisely what went wrong in 326. I mean, I think some people have even speculated that she wasn't killed, that she continued to survive, or maybe just died naturally. Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about her more recently because it's Julian who mentions her. Like, we suddenly get this kind of quite explicit discussion about her, the praise of Fausta in the panegyric for Constantius II. So people speculate that the sons are kind of restoring their mother's memory, that it becomes okay to talk about her. But I find that sort of intriguing. Is Julian reflecting what Constantius II wants or is comfortable with, or is Julian actually stepping out and being taking the initiative by mentioning her and talking about her as this woman of distinguished imperial ancestry. Yes. I mean, some people are going to those coins, the coins of Theodora and Helena. I mean, some people have debated, are they using Theodora on the coins because they can't use their own mother, because of the Fausta Theodora connection? So is she kind of some way a substitute Fausta. I'm not so sure about that. I mean, I think if they'd wanted to put their mother on coins, they probably would have. I think Theodore was there for a very specific reason, as I've said. But yeah, it's another tricky one, isn't it? It's like another $1 million question. What happened? And then, I mean, in some ways, maybe they don't need her, so, their father was Constantine the Great, why would they, need to refer to her? I think that's a possibility. What would have been the value to them of talking about her, so, I mean, did they want to link themselves to Maximian? I mean, Julian, clearly does play up the fact that Maximian is an ancestor in the panegyrics to Constantius II. So Julian does do it again. Julian is mentioning these people. So maybe it's how you interpret that. Is he just reflecting back at Constantius II, what Constantius II is comfortable with? Yes, he wants to hear about Eutropia. He wants to hear about Maximian. He also wants to hear about Constantius I and Constantine. So there, I think it depends how you see Julian. So it's all about how we interpret these people, and as people differ in how they understand what Julian is up to. I'm trying to think about, well, yes, I mean, and then the dynasty doesn't survive much longer after Julian anyway, does it? So in a way, the moment passes. There's a lot of other stuff going on, of course, after 337, with Constantine II being killed, and then eventually Constans being killed in 350. And Constantius II has a lot on his plate. But generally, I think their concern is the male relatives, I think, but, primarily their father. He's the key to their position, really, isn't he? So maybe that's what they're fixated on in particular. Yeah, it's interesting to think about. Sort of, my brain is kind of working through your question, trying to think about it.
Yes, I think it's a difficult one. I'm trying to answer this question in my research right now.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm trying to investigate Fausta and Constantia. Yes, a lot of
it'd be amazing to think about all these people. Yeah, I mean, yes, as you say, like the daughter Constantina, like the sister of Constantius II, her special status as well, and Helena, Julian's cousin and wife. So yes, so yeah, so they are important. But again, the sources tend to talk about them in relation to their brothers or the father. So the mother tends not to surface so much, does she?
Yeah, her death was really a mysterious thing, and we think she has suffered damnatio memoria. So
yes. I mean, Rebecca Asherwood. I mean, she's very kind of wary of damnatio memoriae because it can be maybe more regional, or kind of be maybe more individual decisions about what happens about people's memories, or who deletes names from inscriptions and things like that. So I think she'd probably question the whole concept of that anyway. Yeah, but yeah, like, I come back to Julian. I can't escape Julian, and the fact that he does mention Fausta very explicitly, and Crispus in that panegyric. That maybe that's the thing to base it around. What's going on when he makes those comments.
Yeah.
That might be a way into exploring it. But again, so again, it comes down to evidence. Most people don't really like Constantius II, Ammianus, the the Nicene Christians. They don't like him. Philistorgus actually is interesting. Have you looked? I mean, you have looked at Philistorgus, but he's actually very interested in the imperial women generally. and
That's right.
he gives different perspectives. So yeah, so that might be another way into it to think about.
Yeah, Philisturgis is also a big fan of Constantius, so it's
Yeah.
interesting source.
Yes, and it's comments on Eusebia, as you know. So yeah, so maybe looking for the different voices, the more unusual voices. I think it's maybe a way to go, like looking at Julian and Philisturgis, sort of the non the non-mainstream voices. Maybe see what they're doing.
Well, thank you very much. I don't think we have more questions.
Okay.
No, but beyond the questions, you receive a lot of compliments on chat. So congratulations, Professor.
Thank you very much. That's very kind.
All people
Yes.
like a lot of the conference.
I see they're coming now. Well, I hope people enjoyed it.
Well,
thank you again for asking me.
No.
It was an honor to have your
Yeah.
talk here. It was very interesting, very, very interesting.
Yeah, we need a big conference.
So much today.
So much.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Okay, so we are going to finalize and finish this video in Portuguese for the audience, ok? Pessoal, muito obrigada por terem assistido. Pode continuar, né?
Bom, gente, só ia comentar, agradecemos a todos, né? A gente sabe que quando a gente convida alguém do exterior, a gente tem um problema que é o fuso horário, então a gente queria agradecer a presença de todos. Uma manhã de quarta-feira muito, muito produtiva, então muito obrigada pela presença, participação, envio de perguntas. A gente lembra que a lista de presença vai ficar um pouco disponível ainda, né? Por alguns minutos para quem quiser preencher. E para quem não conseguiu assistir, fica aí, vai ficar disponível no YouTube, né, a conferência do professor para vocês assistirem posteriormente, que realmente vale muito a pena. Então, só agradecimentos mesmo pelo dia de hoje.